Thank you for coming. I want to show, hopefully, to you that passing the baton on isn't simply about finding a replacement to ourselves. Actually, it's about bringing forth a culture in church where people are raising up leaders and constantly passing on responsibility. And sometimes actually doing something even more remarkable, which is passing responsibility onto someone and then happily sitting under their authority and ministry. It's not simply, this is my ministry, who can I pass it on to? At the heart really of this question is, whose ministry is it anyway? And actually none of us can really say it's my ministry. Ultimately, all Christian ministry is Christ's ministry, Christian ministry. And that's essential that we understand that as we begin to grapple with this subject. And so actually one of the besetting sins that causes people not to pass the baton on very well is the sin of pride. And we always need to be checking pride, don't we? As leaders, pride is one of the great besetting sins. And we all need to be checking that. Let me work through some of my material. We'll stop on a couple of occasions and get some more wisdom from the room and try and apply some of these things. The first thing we need to understand about passing the baton on. Now, Daniel, you've said baton. I keep saying baton rather than baton. This is the culture shift, you see, of coming from the UK and the US.
As
so
a speaker, you have the right to...
I'm going to switch between them. I can't help myself. So I'm going to use both.
What's the correct one?
The correct one is always the English one, of course. That's the right answer, isn't it?
The American English.
I say baton, rather than baton. But what we need to see, and this is something that all of you will know, is that passing the baton on is actually a biblical command. It's not a pragmatic decision at the end of the day. Raising up new leaders, more generally, of which this is part, is a biblical imperative. We see that, don't we, in 2 Timothy. I love the pastorals. I think they're great leadership manuals. They're very helpful. They're full of godly wisdom. And there in 2 Timothy, it's very clear. You, therefore, says Paul to Timothy, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So actually there are 4 generations going on there. There's Paul, there he is at the top, and Paul says to Timothy, what you have heard from me in the presence of others, pass on yourself to others who can then teach others. So actually just in one verse you get 4 generations of hearers. And I think the things that Paul is talking about when it comes to Timothy are particularly leadership matters. So Timothy, remember, has been raised in the faith. Timothy inherited, he learned his faith from his mother, from his grandmother. He knew the scriptures from infancy. And therefore Paul isn't just saying to Timothy, all the things you know about Christianity you heard from me and pass them on to others. Very specifically, he's saying to Timothy, the leadership, that those qualities of, in the first instance, church planting and then church pastoring, that you learn from me, entrust to others who can then pass them on. Paul actually is interested in setting up this generational shift of leaders. And the extraordinary thing here is this happens when Timothy is a young man. So in 1 Timothy 4:12, do not let anybody look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers. Now, if you do the maths, working through Acts, at this point, Timothy is not a teenager. He's probably 25 to 30, I guess, that kind of age. But he's still relatively young, and yet even at this stage, Paul is looking to pass the baton on to Timothy, and for Timothy to be looking for the next generation. And I think one of the many weaknesses in evangelicalism is that actually as leaders we only really begin to think about passing the generation on when actually we're coming right towards the end. And one of the things, Daniel, I loved hearing you say just then was how you were raising up indigenous leadership in the local church. That's the whole of Christian ministry, is constantly seeking a new generation. So when I appoint an assistant pastor in the church, maybe who's 25 to 30, one of the things I want to be charging him with is thinking about who he's going to be training up. And he might say to me, well, I'm still training myself. I said, well, Timothy was still learning himself, but you need to have this constant regeneration of leaders. And actually, if the movements that we represent and we're connected with, and we're all connected with movements at some level, if they're going to be healthy, they need to have this constant attitude of raising up the next generation of leaders. I think the movement that I represent was very guilty of this 20 years ago. We waited until a pastor became 65 or 70. And then he would sort of say, retirement's coming, who can take over? It's a disaster. And I'm thankful to God that we've moved away from that. But actually, there's still work to be done to get this kind of ethos, if you like, in the church. Now, why is this ethos in the church in the first place? And actually, it's because of the very nature of God himself. Hello, come on in. It's to do with what God is like. Everything in church ultimately is to do with what God is like. It's a reflection somehow of his nature. So if you just think about it, there are two truths about God. He has an unchanging nature, but he has a continuing purpose. So he says, very often, for example, Exodus 3 verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. What does that verse represent? It represents God's unchanging nature. I am. He never changes. I'm the same God of Abraham. I'm not a different God to Isaac. I'm not a different God to Jacob. I'm the same God. And yet here is the continuing purpose through generations working itself out. So as generations come and generations go, God is unchanging himself and his purpose continues on. So these two characteristics, that God doesn't change and that he continues on, are the very reasons that are behind that biblical command to Timothy. Paul knows that God doesn't change. Paul knows that when he dies, and of course in 2 Timothy he's coming towards the end of his life, he knows that God doesn't change. He still wants people to be saved. That is his desire. There's one mediator between God and men in 1 Timothy 2. He wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. But he also knows that he can't continue that purpose, and God will need to continue it through others. I think this is helpful because passing the baton on, how we might raise up a new generation of leaders, can sound to a church or a movement remarkably about me. It's about me protecting my legacy. It's about me making sure that what I do lasts. But actually, ultimately, it's not about me at all. It's about God and what God is like and what his character is like. That is the essence of passing the baton on. Now, very famously, John Maxwell, who writes a lot about leadership, said this: everything rises and falls on leadership. Now, of course, we could deconstruct that. We could challenge it in different ways in a Christian environment. But there's a sense in which that's true. For example, 1 Timothy 4, the end of 1 Timothy 4, it's pretty clear that the effectiveness of gospel work in Ephesus is dependent on Timothy, on his gifting and on his godliness. So there is some truth in that. But I want to just develop it a little bit further. This is a great book, Next, it's called. Pastoral Succession That Works, by two men called Van der Blurman and Bird. I only really discovered it as I started preparing for this seminar, and then really been helped by it. They take John Maxwell's phrase and they just develop it a little bit. Thinking about movements, thinking about churches, thinking about Christian ministry in general terms, everything rises and falls on the successful transition of leadership. It's not simply about being in the moment, it's about the next moment, and the moment after that, and the moment after that. So there again is that key phrase, just to come back to it again. What you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And there's enough wisdom in the room to know churches and movements where a next generation has not been raised up and a void has been left. And actually a Christian work has died, has closed, or has certainly been severely impaired because there has not been that next generation of leadership. And actually raising up the next generation of leadership is more than just maintenance. Because sometimes as we get older, we're not the right people to lead work. And actually we'd be better off serving someone else who is leading the work. We'll come back to that when we think of some of the Bible examples. Now, the Bible is not fundamentally a book about leadership, is it? The Bible is fundamentally a book about God and his plan to rescue us in Christ. But because Christ is the perfect man, and because Christ is the shepherd leader, it shouldn't surprise us that there are many, many examples of both leadership and transition from one leadership to another. Moses, Joshua, we've talked about. The transition between Aaron and Eleazar, interesting because it skips a generation. Saul, David, Elijah, Elisha, quite a well-known one, of course. Barnabas, Paul, and then Jesus. I've just abbreviated that, the 12 disciples. That's what I meant by 12 disciples. So there are lots and lots of biblical models. What is remarkable is that though the Bible is so full of this transitional leadership, the Christian world is pretty empty. It is remarkable, actually, how few Christians are thinking about it. Now, that's not always the case in the business world. This is another book that I've been reading. It's kind of set in an American context, so some of it is useful, some of it not so much, I think, for us in Europe. Very often, for example, it's dealing with enormous churches, which many of us in Europe just kind of dream of, really. It's called The Elephant in the Boardroom, Speaking the Unspoken About Pastoral Transitions by Carolyn Wees and Russell Crabtree. And this is their observation right at the beginning. The people who are genuinely sound, like Jesus on this issue, are not in the church, but in business. That's very interesting. I worked for 10 years in business where we were thinking all the time about raising up new generations of leaders. And actually we were forced to hand on responsibility and to take risks with people. So I think there's some truth in that actually very often the business world has taken biblical ideas and run with them and developed them and actually left the church behind. I think the same is true for what it's worth, although it's not our subject today. The same is true for what the business world calls continuing professional development. So in the business world, that the concept of you're continually growing and developing your skills and gifting, that's very, very common. Whereas in the church, not so much. But of course, it's there. It's there in 1 Timothy 4. Let everyone see your progress. So these are very common ideas. But the million-dollar question really is this. How do you go about raising up a new generation? What culture do you need to have in the church in order to raise up a new generation? And I want to suggest to you that the key idea really is being a coach. It's coaching the next generation. Coaching is more than training. I think the idea of coaching really is about investing more of yourself in someone. It's about spending time with them. You see, if the word is just training a new generation, let's say, I'll use Emmanuel as an example. Let's say I'm training Emmanuel up, and that's the word I'm using, training. And I might give him a book to read, or I might send him on a course, or I might send him on a longer course away for a week or a couple of weeks. And those things are good things, but they're not really coaching. I'm not really investing myself in him. That the concept of coaching is about, the concept of coaching is about investing yourself in someone. It will involve elements of training, but it's much more than that. I want to think, therefore, about two particular examples. I want to think about Jesus and how he coaches people, and I want to think about Paul and how he coaches people. So let's pick up this idea of modelling first of all. When someone tells you how to do something, it's nice. But actually, what has really driven the growth of YouTube, one of the things that's driven the growth of YouTube, is showing you how to do things. So if I want to change a bulb on my car, I've got a Volvo, so it's a nice, safe Swedish car, and I wanted to change the light. The lights are on all the time on a Volvo, so they go quite often. And I inherited this Volvo from my father. And I thought, I went to the shop, bought the bulb, opened the bonnet, and looked inside. And I thought, I can't work out how to change the bulb in this car. It's all sealed, it's all connected together. I can't work out how to change the bulb. So I opened the manual, and I turned the page, and there's a paragraph in the manual. The bulbs may need replacing every year, or whatever it said. It said, open the bonnet, remove the cover, and insert new bulb. Well, that was no help to me whatsoever. So what did I do? YouTube, how to change the bulb in a Volvo V60 2006. You put it in your specific model and someone's done a video. And I watched them doing it, I pressed pause, and I was able to change it. So actually modelling is a really powerful way, and modelling is more simply than seeing someone do something. So in my world of training, which is to do with preaching, I can preach in church, and people who observe me can learn something by observing me. But actually I need to explain what I'm doing as well in order for them really to get it. So partly it's just observation, partly it's me explaining myself, putting myself on the line. That's good modelling. I once went round a racetrack in a car, and I drove round the first lap with an instructor, and he drove me round the first lap, and it was just a normal family car. I didn't believe a car could go so fast around corners as when he drove it round the track. It was extraordinary. And then he got out and he got in the other side, and I was a young guy, I was 26 or 27, and I thought, I can do this. I've seen him do it, how difficult can it be? So I got in beside him and I drove round, and we got out, and he said, well, that wasn't bad. He said, I went round in 1 minute 30, you went round in 2 minutes 20. You were slow. And I was thinking, well, I just did what you did. And he said, no, this is what you've got to do when you go round the corners. And he started to explain to me how he'd driven, and I didn't quite get to his speed, but I was able to go a bit faster. So modelling actually is more than just letting people see us at work. It's actually about sharing what we're doing. It's about explaining what we're doing. So when Jesus preaches the parable of the sower, he takes his disciples aside and he explains what it means, which is more than just being a teacher, because that parable is key to Christian ministry. So the parable kind of describes how Jesus' ministry is going to be received. So when Jesus takes his disciples to one side, he's sharing what his ministry is doing in order for them to learn. So that's really helpful, thank you. And let's just pause and think how that might affect us as we pass something on. It feels actually quite a high investment level. You know, let's go back to the preaching example. If I've got someone in church and he can just sit in the front row each week and listen to me preach, it doesn't require much of my time, does it? It's just the same as anybody else. But if I'm going to take him aside afterwards and spend time with him and show him how I worked on the sermon, perhaps next week work through a sermon with him, and that's going to require time. It's costly. So this coaching, this idea of passing the baton on, we mustn't be. We mustn't miss the point that actually it's costly. It's a sacrificial thing to do. Let's just pick up the idea of an example. It's slightly different from modelling. So I think modelling and sharing there, we were talking about ministry. This is what I do. I think there is something in what you're saying about example, which is about how you live. Now this is important, isn't it? Because leadership is not just about gifting. We all know that, right? Good leadership is about godliness and gifting. That's why 1 Timothy 3 is in 1 Timothy, because Paul is interested that the next lot of leaders are godly leaders. They have certain character, certain qualities. So actually, when Jesus is coaching, he's not only showing people what to do, or even how to do it, that's the ministry bit, that's this bit here, he's showing people how to live. And in order for that to work, he has to share. It's sharing again. But he has to do what Paul says, that little phrase in 1 Thessalonians. He has to share his life with people. So I don't think you can coach a next generation simply by sharing an office with them and going through your diary. Actually, Christian ministry and Christian passing the baton on means actually sharing your life with those you're trying to train. And again, that's quite costly. It means having you in their home, having them in your home. It means letting them see how you parent your children if you've got children, or how you relate to your wife if you're married. It means letting them see you in the good times and some of the bad times. And I think that's something that actually the business world doesn't get in quite the same way. So when I've been mentored and coached in the business world, the focus has all been on number one, here, and very little on number two. But actually, because Christian ministry is dependent upon our lives, therefore we have to be training people in that area as well. Great, that's a great start. Let's just talk about sending. You introduced that one as well. Thank you very much, Jan. And it's very noticeable, isn't it, how Jesus sends people out. He chose 12 and he had them with him. They had very different backgrounds. They weren't all like him, didn't all come from the same place as him. So they weren't all exactly similar, were they? Did he treat all those 12 the same? Let's just think about that. That's quite an interesting question. Did Jesus treat all those 12 the same? He had. So sometimes he treated them all the same, but very often he had 3, Peter, James and John, that he took with him at key moments. So who was on the Mount of Transfiguration? All 12? No. Peter, James and John. So it would appear that there was a kind of... It's not favouritism, is it? It would appear that Jesus was very strategic, really, about how he was training people. He understood that some he needed to invest more in. And again, I think that's a great model for coaching. I'm not suggesting that you have to have 12 people. I don't think there's anything particularly spiritual about the number 12 when it comes to our passing the baton on. We only have one person we're working with, it may be 2. But for example, if you've got 2 people in church, just 2 that you're working with, it doesn't necessarily follow that you treat them exactly the same. It may be appropriate, depending on the individual, depending on the circumstances, to invest more in one than in the other. And Jesus gives us liberty to do that. It's a wisdom call at the end of the day. There's no verse in the Bible that says, if his name begins with A, spend more time with him, or anything like that. It's a wisdom call, but it's not wrong to spend more time with one than perhaps another. That may be because of their background, it may be because of their skills, maybe because of their gifts, it may be just because they need more help. All kinds of different reasons. Okay, we see the focus. We still haven't got to the sending out, sorry. The sending out that Jesus does, he does it on a few occasions, doesn't he? Sometimes it's just the 12, sometimes 72. Actually, that's a good point. There's a 72 up there as well, isn't there? So there are clearly different levels that Jesus is operating at. The sending out is very risky, isn't it? Have you ever thought about that? I think to myself, when I read the Gospels and I read them honestly, which is a good thing to do, I think to myself, I wouldn't have sent out those 12. They weren't ready. For one thing, Pentecost hasn't come. I'm thinking to myself, surely they would have been better with Jesus. But no, he's training them, he's coaching them. He's taking risks with them, actually. And that risk-taking is especially seen because one of the 12 is, of course, Judas. Yeah, I thought you said Joshua then. Yeah, it's Judas. There are 2 Judases, but the one that's called Iscariot, we know is a thief. We know that Satan hasn't entered into him in this early initial period of coaching, but Jesus knows the one who will betray him. And so there's an element of risk-taking. I think where Christians do get involved with coaching, we're quite risk-averse. The idea of failure is, don't want to fail at all. So the idea of letting someone have, a go. When I drove down this racetrack, I went round with the instructor. I felt like I was quite on the limit, actually, as I was going round for my lap. We went and did another lap, and he told me the times, and then he got out of the car and he said, "You're on your own." And part of me was quite excited by that, and part of me was absolutely terrified, because there had been a couple of occasions when we'd gone round the lap that he'd leant over. It's a UK car, so he leans this way. He'd leant over and grabbed the wheel and just adjusted the line. And now I thought, I haven't got anybody to do that. What happens if I spin off over there? But there's an element of risk-taking involved in coaching others. Again, you see that in Jesus' model. So what tends to happen, or can happen in Christian circles, is that we send people because we don't really want to do it ourselves. Right? We can dress it up in coaching and training, but actually what I'm doing is I'm giving someone a job that I don't really want to do. But clearly the ministry that Jesus gives to those individuals he sends out is his ministry. They're going to do the same things that he does. They're going to heal, they're going to teach, and they go from village to village, exactly what Jesus is going to do. And when they come back, he asks them how they got on. They tell him what they saw, and he reflects back on it, and he teaches them a lesson from it. So that idea of an intentional sending which is followed up, I mean, it all sounds like it could come out of a business manual, but it comes out of a gospel. That's exactly how Jesus trains the next generation. Now, I think all these and many more are elements of how we should be thinking about training people in church generally, but actually certainly passing the baton on. It's not simply a matter of getting to a certain age and saying, right, let's put the advert in the paper or online and let's see who applies. So if you've come hoping that I'll help you write the advert, that's not really what passing the baton on is about in Christian terms. It's about having a culture where we're constantly taking risks with people, sending them out. And actually you see that a bit more with Paul. Let me tell you just a little bit about Paul and Timothy. Paul, I think, is a great coach. You don't always see it because the stories that Luke chooses to tell about Paul are very selective. The Acts of the Apostles covers quite a few years, but actually you only get a very few hours of action, really. It's like a very edited highlights. And nevertheless, you do get lots of people appear with Paul, and you see how Paul relates to individuals. And I think this is very interesting. How does Paul relate to Timothy? Well, Paul relates to Timothy like this. First of all, he hears about him from someone else. It's not someone he's identified. Someone else tells Paul about Timothy, and he takes him on board in Acts chapter 16. So the little story at the beginning of Acts 16, which is the story I like to tell all men to prove that ministry is suffering and costly, because of course Timothy has to be circumcised. But that little story about Timothy at the beginning of Acts 16, what does he do? Paul takes Timothy with him. And off they go. They're in Derby first of all, and they go to some other places, Lystra, and Timothy is with Paul for quite a few years actually. And then what you get towards the end of Acts 17, or sorry, not towards the end, but Acts 17 verse 4, is you get Paul leaving Timothy behind. So in Acts 17 verse 4, Paul has been in Thessalonica, and then he goes to Berea. And in Berea, the Jews who were in Thessalonica come along and they start stirring people up, and Paul has to leave Berea. He leaves Timothy behind. In other words, he's got to the stage in his training where it's not with, it's behind. In other words, Timothy is to take on the work that Paul has already done. Paul has led the way. Paul has begun the work. He's not asking Timothy to start from scratch. Paul has begun the work, but he now gives it to Timothy to carry on. And then Timothy just disappears from the scene because the focus is on Paul for a bit, but then he appears again in Acts 19:22 when we're talking about Macedonia. And what happens there is that Timothy is sent ahead. So Paul now trusts Timothy. He's proved himself when he was with Paul. He's proved himself when he was left behind and he carried on the work. Now he's sent ahead. You don't do that straight away. But once he's proved himself, you're willing to send him ahead. Now, I think this is a great paradigm for any kind of coaching, training, in any kind of setting, in the Christian world actually, and in not the Christian world, with, behind, ahead. Now, that pattern, with, behind, ahead, probably took, 5 years. We're not quite sure some of the dates, are we, towards the end of Acts. But something like several years anyway. Paul trains, leaves behind, sends ahead. I think largely that's what Jesus is also doing. It's not quite so clear. But when Paul sends out the 12 and the 72, he's giving them work that he's already begun. So although it's in places he hasn't been, I think actually that's a bit like this, leaving them behind. He's giving them the same work that he's done. But he says to them the night before he dies, and he gives them a new ministry, he says, you're going to do things that I haven't done. You're going to do greater things than these. In other words, he's sending them out. He's sending them ahead. So I think actually that same pattern is present in the coaching of Jesus. Now, I find that quite challenging and quite convicting. The people I'm thinking about working with, I've got to be working with them on the left-hand side, sharing my life with them, remember, being intentional about the training I'm giving them and explaining what I'm doing, there comes a point where I've got to say, right, we've started this together, now you get on with it. But then once they've proved themselves, then I'm willing to send them ahead. I heard of a church pastor not long ago in our network who was training up an assistant, and he was operating in box number 1 over here. If we call that box number 1, this is 2, this is 3. He was operating with his assistant in box number 1, and then they sent off a church of about 120. They sent off 20 people to plant a new church. Now, what would most churches do? They'd send off the assistant with the new church. What did this pastor do? He left him behind. And he went with the new church. Because he was at stage 2. And I thought to myself at first, well, that's very humble, that's brave. And then I thought about this little pattern, and I thought, yeah, he's done exactly the right thing. Now, there'll be another moment when that guy goes ahead a bit further down the line. But right at the moment, in that coaching environment, in that passing the baton on environment, it was right actually to say, going to leave him behind. I've made the start for him, and actually keeping something going is much easier than starting it from scratch. So I wonder how that works in our contexts. I think the same kind of patterns emerge. Ultimately, you want to get to box 3, don't you, with the people you're passing the baton on? Ultimately, the person that I'm passing the baton on, I don't want him just to maintain what's been done. I want him to press ahead. I want him to break new ground, because we always want the kingdom to be expanding. So ultimately, our aim is to get over to number 3. But actually, passing the baton on, I think, is about 1, 2, 3. And actually, if we are investing in number 1 and then we just say, right, over to you, I'm gone now, I don't think actually we'll be training people very well. We won't actually be passing the baton on very well. Let's briefly, we've got about 20 minutes left, so let's just talk about some of the dangers if we don't pass the baton on. I think sometimes, in my experience, some leaders need a bit of a kick to say, if you don't do this, some bad things might happen. And here are some of the things that might happen if we don't pass the baton on. Number 1 is that the ministry we represent itself might get tired. If we're leading it beyond our sell-by date, and especially if we're nearing retirement or getting towards the end, and there's not the same impetus in us or the same desire to think of new things, to do things in new ways, the ministry itself can get tired. And actually, once the ministry becomes tired, it becomes less effective, because it has less energy in it. So, and not only does the ministry get tired, the danger is, and these two are connected of course, that we as leaders get tired. Because if you're doing the same thing over and over again, there's a routine about that, there's a monotony about it, that actually makes us tired, and therefore that has an impact on the church or on the ministry that we represent. So ministry can get tired, and we can get tired if we don't pass the baton on. It's very clear actually that when you get to the end of 2 Timothy, that Paul is tired. He's reaching the end of his life. He's been poured out. He's been through it, hasn't he? All the physical suffering he's been through and the traumas he's been through, he's tired. And if he hadn't passed on the baton to Timothy, then the ministry would have suffered. I think thirdly, if we don't pass the baton on, people who work with us will become unengaged or disengaged. So actually, if we've got leaders or people with potential to be leaders in our congregations, we need to give them responsibility, not only to develop them, not only to pass on the baton, but so they don't up and leave and go somewhere else, or just get fed up with it all. I'm very involved with the Christian ministry in India, and one of the things I see in India is a reluctance to pass the baton on. And what happens when you have a reluctance to pass the baton on is that leaders are raised up in the church and they just go and start their own ministry down the road. And so there is a multiplication of ministries, but not in a healthy way, with them all competing on the same road. And it's generally because the leader has not passed on the baton. He's not seen the potential in a new leader. He's wanted to guard it for himself, and so actually the work is ultimately damaged. I think also, whether we like it or not, if we keep hold of the baton for too long, it becomes about me. And there's a very simple example of this. I like watching athletics. You might not think I'm probably not good at athletics, look at me, but I like watching athletics. And I love watching the relay races. But here's the thing about the relay races, you often can't remember the names of the different people who are in the team. You remember who won the 400 metres just running around on their own. They came across, there was a gold medal, lots of pictures on the front of the paper. But then in the Olympics, the 4 by 100 metres, same distance, they put a picture of the team on, and you don't remember their names in quite the same way. They're not the heroes in quite the same way. Actually, the danger is if we don't pass the baton on, whether we like it or not, we will make the ministry about us. And that's really dangerous. Now you might say, well, no, I don't do that. I'm very careful to make sure the ministry is not about me. But if we don't pass the baton on, that always happens. I can think of, we've got 600 churches in our network. I can think of 5 churches at the moment where the pastor has not passed the baton on. And all 5 are in trouble because they are so focused on him. There's a very famous church that's not part of our network, but where that's happened in the UK, where the church has become liberal because the evangelical didn't pass a baton on. He kind of lost his faith, and because there was just him and no one else, the church went along with him. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that would ever happen to any of you, but it's a risk we need to be aware of. One of the dangers. And conversely, we need to see there are opportunities. So what are some of the opportunities of passing the baton on? They are about revitalising work, breathing life back into work. It's amazing how many leaders you speak to who think they're doing a good job and the ministry is growing and there are lots of healthy signs, but when they pass the baton on, when they raise up a new leader, things just take off even further. So it's not enough. Let me just draw a little graph at the moment, how that works. Let's say a ministry is growing like this. It's growing maybe 3% a year, let's say. Well, the evangelical growth in the UK is 0%. Right? So if your ministry was growing 3% a year, you'd say, oh, that's great. Bucking the trend, doing better than everyone else. But actually you discover that if you would appoint a new leader, maybe it would do that. There's a real opportunity actually in just injecting new life into ministry and injecting new vision. One of the hardest things for leaders when it comes to passing the baton on is when a new leader just has a slightly different view of the vision, sees it a different way. It can become quite personal actually and quite difficult. But actually injecting new vision into a church, that can be a great benefit. As can actually having engaged workers. So if it's true that one of the dangers of not passing the baton on is workers who are unengaged, it must follow, mustn't it, that actually passing the baton on can have great benefits. So if I've got a young guy that I'm training up in church, if he thinks to himself, it'd be great to serve in this church. I love the people know me, they know my strengths, they know my weaknesses. And if he knows that I'm going to sit loose to my responsibilities and maybe one day pass them on, he'll want to stay around, he'll want to invest himself, he'll want to be engaged. The work will be full of life. And it's a flip side to this one. Person-centered ministry if you don't do anything, but if you are willing to pass the baton on, you demonstrate that actually it's not about you, it's about Christ. And again, Daniel, that's why I was encouraged by your testimony, brother. As you pass the baton on to others, actually, what does that show people? It shows people it's not about Daniel's ministry. It's about Christ's ministry. That's what it's all about. We've got just about 10 minutes left. I'd love just to go back to those examples in the Bible and show you some of the key challenges that I see there. Here's the first one. And I think this is perhaps not so relevant in parts of Europe as it perhaps is in other parts of the world. But in some parts of the world, maintaining a family dynasty, it can be crippling. And lots of Christian ministries are built around family dynasties. And surely the lesson of Saul and David is that actually that can be crippling for ministry. When Saul died, the kingdom didn't go to David. The kingdom went to, well, first of all, to one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth. And actually, down the line, there were problems with other members of Saul's clan, with Sheba, a man called Sheba, with Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, who were all loyal to the clan of Benjamin. And there were all kinds of civil wars and little skirmishes that went on all through the life of David, all because the clan of Benjamin the tribe of Benjamin wanted to maintain the dynasty. So I don't know if that's a particular temptation. By the way, we shouldn't write it off. Solomon came after David, and he was God's appointed successor. So it's not that we should never appoint children, but we need to be very careful appointing children to make sure that we're not just creating a family dynasty. That's one of the first challenges I think I see. Second challenge, I think, is risk aversion. I don't know why this says A as well, because it should say B, but there we are. Risk aversion. I think the lesson of Paul and Timothy shows us that if you are risk averse, you don't really bring on new leaders. Paul is not risk averse with Timothy. He takes on a guy he doesn't really know, he's just heard about. He invests in him, he leaves him behind, he sends him ahead, and up is raised a key leader in the early church, Timothy, wonderful leader. We see it in the ministry of Jesus, we saw that earlier. So we need to be prepared to take risks, which means we need to be prepared for failure. That will sometimes happen. Challenge number 3, I think, is duplication versus multiplication. What I think both happens with Elijah and Elisha and Jesus and the disciples is they don't simply find someone who will do what they've done. So passing the baton on, this can be a real temptation. Passing the baton on can be thinking, who can I find that's just like me? Who will keep things going in the way that I would do them? That's my guy. But actually, both in terms of Elijah and Elisha and with Jesus and the disciples, it's about expanding the ministry. Some of the things that Jesus says to his disciples are shocking. You've seen amazing things, Jesus says to his disciples, but you're going to see more amazing things when I'm gone. It's extraordinary. And actually, Jesus multiplies through these 12. He doesn't just create 12 people who are going to do exactly what he does. He creates 12 individuals, 11, and then Matthias is added, who get sent out into different parts of the world. So the key thing when we're thinking about passing the baton on is how are we going to grow? How are we going to multiply? Rather than just how are we going to duplicate? So when I left Proclamation Trust that I was working for, it wasn't simply about let's find who's going to replace Adrian. That's the wrong question to ask. The question to ask is what opportunity is there now to multiply ministry, not just to duplicate ministry. One last challenge which I really like is the one, I think, of Barnabas and Paul. Very early on when you hear about Paul, it is Barnabas and Paul. Barnabas is the key guy. He's the member of the church in Antioch. It seems that Paul is very much his kind of sidekick, if you like. Not quite sidekick, but his assistant. And that's rightly so, because of course Paul's background is he's come from this background of persecuting. He was Saul of Tarsus. And in fact, the church has taken a risk with him, haven't they? So it's very much Barnabas and Paul. But very quickly, as you go through the book of Acts, it changes from Barnabas and Paul, and it becomes Paul and Barnabas. And in fact, who is the apostle to the Gentiles? It is Paul. It's not Barnabas. Barnabas has a great ministry, and he spends a lot of time with Paul, but there's a switch. And I think one of the great challenges for passing the baton on is being able to switch over. I help lead a church in East London, a church of about 400, I guess, and the pastor had been there 27 years, been a great servant of the church, and he was coming up to retirement. He had 4 years to go to retirement. And he'd trained a lot of people, he'd sent them out, And it was coming to the stage now where they were thinking, who is going to be the guy who's going to take over from Pastor Ken as a senior pastor? And we developed as elders a plan, and the plan was this: we would take someone on over a 4-year period. And for the first 2 years, he would be the assistant to Pastor Ken. He'd already done some training somewhere else. We knew him. We'd had some connection with him and so on. So he wasn't a risk in that sense. He was someone we'd sent out and had come back. But we thought we'll give him 2 years with Pastor Ken. And at the end of the 2 years, Pastor Ken said, this was his decision, he said, at the end of 2 years, when I've still got 2 years to go, I'll become his assistant. He'll be the lead pastor. I'll be his assistant. Now that requires remarkable humility, doesn't it? Because actually it would be easy for him at that point to say, well, I'm off now. He's in charge, I'm off. But he was saying, no, for 2 years, I'm going to serve him. It's that kind of, he must become greater, I must become less. I know that's obviously taking that out of context, but it's that same idea. That actually the way to pass the baton on to this guy is for me to be around. I'll do whatever he wants me to do. And so Pastor Ken said, I'll preach whenever he wants me to. If he wants me to preach in all the tiny services and the Sunday after Christmas that no one wants to do, I don't mind doing that. I'll do whatever he wants me to do, whatever will help him. If he wants to ask me for advice, he can ask me for advice, but he's the boss. Now, I think that's pretty rare in church life. What generally happens is someone would appoint a successor if they're involved in it, wave goodbye, say, I'm off. Thanks, you get on with life. But that seems to me to be this kind of switch around pattern. Actually, raising up leaders is about raising up people that you would be very happy serving. You'd be very happy sitting at their feet. I used to make them when I was teaching at the Proclamation Trust and we were training preachers. We had these practice sessions. And when we had people for 2 years at the college, and in the first year of college they would do kind of little mini sermons and we'd comment on them, and I would clearly be the teacher and I would be teaching them and helping them. Towards the end, after they'd been with us 2 years, I would say to each guy who was about to preach, right, you're about to preach to me. Right now, I know we're in a classroom, but right now I'm sitting at your feet. And what you're demonstrating actually is a kind of leadership which is happy to give up the baton. It's not grabbing hold of it, but is happy to give it up.